5th episode of Unlocking the Secrets of Autism. My name's Karen Raposa. I'm here with our co-hosts, my husband Russell Raposa, and we have Michael Dressler and Amy Dressler as our co-hosts today as well. We are really excited, and thank you for joining us again, but we have a very special guest with us for the show today, and we are just so excited to have Dr. Daniel Moreno De Luca, who is here to join us from Bradley Hospital. And I'd like to share a little bit about Dr. Moreno De Luca's background. I can tell you, after reading his CV, I was absolutely amazed that he even has time to be with us today. I asked him already, does he ever have time to sleep? So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Moreno De Luca. He's a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist at the Vrecchia Clinic for children with autism and developmental disabilities at Bradley Hospital, where he also provides genetic psychiatry consultation to people with autism spectrum disorder or neuropsychiatric conditions arising from a clinically identifiable genetic cause. We will talk a little bit more about Bradley Hospital in this program today, but if you're not familiar with Bradley Hospital, they are in East Providence, Rhode Island, and they are an amazing hospital, psychiatric hospital here in southeastern part of New England. He is also an assistant professor at the Warren Alpert Medical School of Brown University and performs research on the genetics of autism with a focus on precision medicine, and we'll learn more about that as well. After receiving his medical degree, he completed a research fellowship at the University of Bologna in Italy and received a master's degree in neuroscience at the Sorbonne in Paris. He then moved to the United States, where he completed a postdoctoral fellowship in neurogenetics at Emory University in Atlanta, and then finished psychiatry training at Yale University and child and adolescent training at Brown University. I'm sure you've never heard of any of those places. Besides English, Dr. Moreno De Luca is fluent in Spanish, French, and Italian, and is certified by Lifespan to provide patient care in these languages. So welcome, Dr. Moreno De Luca. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here.
I'm just amazed that you have time to be here with all of the work that you've done, and we're so excited to learn more from you about your background and all the work that you've been doing specifically in the field of genetics as it relates to autism, and I know our viewers are going to be excited to hear this.
Yes, again, thank you very much.
I wanted to start with a question, and if in this question you could also help our viewers understand, really basically, how is someone tested for genetics? What does that mean? Mm-hmm. Is it a blood test? Is it a saliva test? Mm-hmm. And then if you could also talk about the fact that there's a lot of discussion about genetics in medicine today. Mm-hmm. We hear about it in a lot of different aspects. So could you comment on the roles of genetics in psychiatry specifically, but especially as it relates to autism and developmental disorders?
Sure. So I think one of the areas where we usually like to start is with a quick refresher of what genetics are, because for some people they have that really fresh in their minds, and then some other people don't remember all that much about those things. So I wanted to start by talking, giving a crash course of genetics really quickly. We know that genetics is the science that studies how we store the information in our cells, and that information is going to provide the building blocks to make a person, pretty much. Now, we also know that there are several changes in the genetic code that all of us have, and that's going to determine many of our characteristics, like why some people have blue eyes or brown eyes, height, and many of those things. So all of that information is encoded in the chromosomes. So those, if we think about a library, those would be like chapters on a book. So we would have 23 chapters on each of those books, and we have one pair of each of those chromosomes. And then 22 of those chapters are going to be identical. We get one from mom and one from dad. And then the last chapter is going to be the sex chromosome. So we get one X and one Y if we are a person that is born as a male, or one X and another X if it's a person that is born as a female. So then that sort of comprises all of the genetic information. Now, I just told you that there are different genetic changes that are going to account for the different characteristics that we have. But then there are also some genetic changes that happen in key parts of the genome where we are not generally able to tolerate that really well without that leading to some medical conditions or psychiatric conditions. So those changes could be an absence of a genetic region, so that we call that a deletion, or an extra genetic region, and we call that a duplication. So whole chunks of DNA that are present either in an extra copy or in one less copy. And that would be akin to a missing paragraph in one of the chapters. So sometimes those genetic changes can lead to problems, and some other times it's okay to have those. So there's a lot of studies trying to identify which of those are absolutely crucial to have and which of those we can do okay without. And then those are called copy number variants in aggregate. So deletions or duplications, the whole thing comes together as copy number variants. And then we can have also changes in the letters of the actual words in the paragraph. And those would be called single nucleotide variants. And again, sometimes it doesn't really matter if you spell behavior with a U or without a U. We know that that's the same word. But for some words, if you remove a letter, that's not going to make sense anymore. So genetic testing, to get back to your question after this long-winded explanation, looks at the extra or missing chunks of DNA or at the changes in those letters. For those genetic tests to be done, it usually involves getting a blood sample, although lately some of those tests can be done from saliva as well. But the highest quality tends to be a blood sample. And it sounds fancy, but it's pretty much like any other standard test that you would get. You just go to a lab, they take a sample, they send it out, and then you get the result. So it doesn't involve any invasive procedures or anything else different than what you would do for a typical blood test.
I never heard it described that way, and now I actually think I understand it better than I have in my entire life.
As well. Oh my God.
Thank you for sharing it in that format to help us.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Moreno de Luca, I have a question. I understand there are many different types of tests. What are the ones people should be doing, and are there some that are not indicated?
Sure, that's a great question. So we just had a little bit of a refresher of all of that genetic information, and then we were talking about tests that are going to help us see if there's extra or missing whole chunks of DNA, or if there are changes in the actual letters of the words. The current recommendations by many professional societies, which include, and I'm just going to name them because it's pretty important, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, American Society of Human Genetics, International Society of Psychiatric Genetics, and many others, say that we should be offering genetic testing to every person with autism. Again, I think the area to stress there is that it is our professional obligation as physicians and our ethical obligation to offer the tests, but it's always important to remember that the ultimate decision on whether or not to have testing is in the families. So this should be part of a careful discussion. The vast majority of the families that we work with would like to have that information and agree to have the testing done, but there are some families who prefer not to do that, and that's okay. And it's important to have those conversations. Now, the specific tests that are indicated are called chromosomal microarray testing and Fragile X testing. So Fragile X is a test that has been around for a long time that looks for a specific type of genetic change that causes a condition called Fragile X. And it needs a special test because of the molecular things that are going on. Is not something that you would pick up with any of the other tests. And then chromosomal microarray testing looks for those extra or missing chunks of DNA. Now, we didn't talk about testing for looking at the actual changes in the letters. That testing is called either whole exome or whole genome sequencing, and that's the one that makes it into the news these days. And currently, that is being used as a referral after a negative test from the ones before. But there are new guidelines coming out saying that that should be the first line testing. Now, a couple of things that are always important to mention is that when we hear the word genetics, we think that it's this broad single concept, and everything goes in there at the same time. But genetics actually brings together many different areas, some of which are ready for us to embrace them in the clinic, and some of which we can't really use right now because we need to develop more of the evidence that's going to allow us to talk about those things. So one of the tests that comes up often is called pharmacogenetic testing. I don't know if you guys have had a chance to hear about that, but the principle is really interesting. It says that you can test the way that your body metabolizes several medications to see how well you're going to respond to those. Now, this is a different type of genetic test than the one that we have been talking about, and there's only one very clear indication where that should be done, and that is people of Asian ancestry who are going to be put on a specific type of medication called carbamazepine. Just because people of Asian ancestry can have a very significant reaction called Stevens-Johnson's. It's a very severe allergic reaction that we definitely don't want to happen. So on that single, tiny, narrow indication, those tests should be done. But then in the greater scheme of things, the evidence supporting pharmacogenetic testing is not really there. So I know that this comes up a lot. I have several of my patients come with the pharmacogenetic testing results, and they are not in a place where they are meaningfully and clinically useful right now. So the ones we spoke about, microarray testing and Fragile X, they should be offered all the time. Pharmacogenetic testing, not so much.
They should be offered all the time, in your opinion. Since when? At what? Right? Because we talked earlier about the age of our children, and so how long has this kind of been something that probably would be recommended?
That is a great point. So the technology has been advancing so quickly that things were only starting to get traction 10 years ago, and it wasn't until a little bit more recently that became a standard recommendation. So you raise a pretty good point that many people who are right now in their 20s or even in their mid-teens may not have had any of these tests or may not have even heard that this testing is part of the standard recommendations as well.
And so would it be something that some families might want to consider doing? Again, it's a personal decision, but there might be some value in doing that.
Absolutely.
If your child has not or is at that age and it wasn't offered earlier.
Absolutely. So there are a lot of things that can come from that, and I'm happy to talk about some of those benefits and some of those factors that are going to influence the decision of getting genetic testing or not. I also want to point out that because it's a professional recommendation, it should be covered by insurance. So it needs a pre-authorization, but it's not something that the families are going to have to pay out of their own pocket and do in their own terms. It's part of the standard medical management that should be covered by insurance.
With genetic testing, would if our child tests differently because of his genetics to, let's say, the Raposa's child, would the medication be different as far as, would he be treated differently as far as how they handle his files and and himself?
I think that's an excellent question, and it's one that we hear often. And I'll answer that one and tag along a couple of the other things that are relevant when you do genetic testing. So it turns out that all of these professional societies recommend genetic testing because there's a high yield of finding an abnormality. So in people with autism, up to 40% of people we test are going to have a genetic abnormality that explains the autism or the developmental disabilities.
Wow.
40%. So what that means is that if you have seen 3 kids with autism, one of them for sure is going to have one of these rare genetic abnormalities. And what I like to tell to other physicians and other colleagues that I work with is that if you think that you haven't seen them, they have certainly seen you. So it's up to us to be able to identify those things. And now with that information, it's a good proportion of people who are going to come back with an abnormal result. But those abnormal results are actually composed of many hundreds and sometimes even thousands of different rare genetic changes. So when we bring them together, they account for 40% of changes, but individually they are very rare. So we would have to look at them one by one. And once we look at them one by one, we start to uncover that they may increase risk for autism or other developmental disabilities, but also for other potential medical issues. Let's say some people may have kidney problems or things that are completely unrelated in theory to their psychiatric symptoms. And I think this is a long-winded way of saying that that's where this information could be very useful for clinical management.
Yeah.
We use a lot of medications that are very much needed and approved for those purposes, but that may have side effects that affect either the kidneys or weight or the metabolic profile. And just knowing what the underlying medical vulnerabilities of people are based on that genetic information could be tremendously helpful to make sure that you do no harm and that you plan thoroughly the treatment of the kiddos that you see and the adults.
I have one more question. I was just wondering, you talk about genetic testing, and we talk about that every child that has autism or is diagnosed with autism should be tested. So, but everyone's not testing. And we're wondering why isn't that happening? Are we doing something wrong with spreading
Why
the
aren't
word?
pediatricians all saying, let's get your child tested?
We talked about this earlier. I liked that answer.
So it's an excellent question, and it's one that we are keenly interested in answering as well, because we have these recommendations and then we have the actual things that are happening in the real world. So I can tell you guys that although we should be aiming to offer testing to 100% of people, the reality is that in our general environment, it's happening in around 5% of cases.
Oh my goodness.
So there is a 95% gap to fill.
Terrible.
And why is that?
That's what we're trying to find out. So we recently did a study looking at attitudes, perceptions, and results of genetic testing in families from Rhode Island, and we have gotten over 250 responses. Just looking and seeing whether there are any family factors that are modulating the degree of testing. And it turns out that the vast majority of families do want that information, and they just have not been offered testing by their physicians. So I think there's a lot of that is happening on the side of our colleagues who are very well-meaning and also have a lot of things on their plate right now. And with all of these technologies emerging and being new, they might not have had the time to know exactly what they should be putting on their radar and what they should be ordering. And I think there's also the perception for some people that, and we hear this question a lot, like, I'll do testing, but how is that going to change what I do for my kid, for my patient? And the argument is that there is a very significant amount of things that are going to impact, that those results are going to impact. So one of them is putting an end to the diagnostic odyssey. So we know that many of the families that we see have to go through these very long evaluation processes that may involve all sorts of tests. They might end up having muscle biopsies and many different things. So then just knowing that this is what's responsible for the clinical features that you're seeing brings a sense of relief. It sort of puts an end, it helps families understand that this is it. So many families carry tremendous guilt, thinking whether their kid has autism because they went jogging for too long when mom was pregnant, and this is particularly unfair in my view with moms. And this helps to alleviate a lot of that guilt that might be in there.
True.
But it also allows us to understand whether or not these things could happen again in a future pregnancy. It allows families to connect with one another. Like, many families feel that they're absolutely alone in this journey, but once you have that genetic result, and then you know that another family 3 states away or in another country has something similar, then you can bond and connect and have a huge support network that was unavailable before. And that's just to name a few of the benefits.
I mean, that kind of, I think you've sort of answered my question, is the implications of the testing and then how it can help with medical care. So if you have that, because I know my son did, and he's 18, and he did have Fragile X testing at like 2, just because I think the neurologist, the specialist, wanted to rule it out. I don't know if any other tests were done or not. A couple of tests I think were done. But so are you saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, that at this point there is a genetic predisposition that if you test a child, you can say, yes, look at this, your child definitely has autism?
Good question, because there's so many nuances in the question that I want to make sure that I address them. So autism is a clinical diagnosis and it is behaviorally defined, meaning that people like me in psychiatry, we see a person and if they have the clinical features of autism, we make that diagnosis. And that is to say that there's no genetic test that is going to diagnose autism. But once the diagnosis of autism is made based on those clinical symptoms, genetic testing is going to allow us to understand a lot more about the specific profile and the strengths and vulnerabilities that people might have. It's also important to point out that by understanding those sort of behavioral phenotypes or clinical features, we're also able to identify strengths. So much of medicine is based on deficits and areas where people are not doing all that well. But then we can also see where people have particular strengths to try to bolster those, because those are going to be a huge bang for our buck in regards to helping people achieve their maximum potential as well.
Is there a central location, I mean, this is a little off topic, but is there a central location where this information is held? If, say in Rhode Island, I mean, I don't know if it would involve Ricard or not, but if you're getting genetic testing done, a big group of people in one state, does it go into one central bank of information, or is it national? Or?
So there's a couple of things. So you just mentioned RICARD, which is the Rhode Island Consortium for Autism Research and Treatment, a large study that's going on here in Rhode Island. And this is a research study, meaning that all the information that is acquired goes to a central research database and is used for research purposes, for understanding more about autism. Now, all of the tests that we have talked about are clinical tests, meaning that they should be going into your electronic health record.
Right.
And that's the repository, that's where the data should live. Now, many of the genetic testing laboratories, and we have many of them here in Rhode Island as well, also contribute to national and international efforts where people pull together their data to help with the interpretation, because these things are so rare that how are you going to know if this is abnormal or not if they're so rare? So there's efforts to share data which have been very successful to date.
So it's kept in Rhode Island, but it's shared with other national organizations.
So for the research piece, it is kept in Rhode Island, and sometimes we work with other researchers outside, and the idea is to share that as well. It's also important to note that nothing will be shared without the family's consent.
Right.
So the families who consent to participate in those research projects are going to have the final word. And now for the clinical side of things, no identifiable data is shared. So no one is going to know if you get a genetic test. People are not sending your name and your social security number along with those tests, but they do send the results and the indication for testing. So it could be something as simple as this patient was sent in to be tested for autism, and we found this abnormality. Those two pieces of data tend to go to a central repository where a lot of people look at that information to make better decisions.
When you said that some people are asking how they go about it, if you go to your pediatrician and you already have a clinical diagnosis of autism, can you say, I want my child tested genetically?
Yes.
Would they be able to handle it, and what would they do?
Yes, so that's the first step. And we've been working a lot with the physicians and healthcare providers in Rhode Island, and actually nationally and internationally as well, to develop the systems that would allow them to tackle those questions. They can be initiated by parents, and you can say that you want your testing done. And if physicians are comfortable doing that testing themselves, they could order it, or they could also refer you to medical genetics services or to services like the one we have at Bradley Hospital. But it should, as we were saying, it should be covered by insurance. It just requires that pre-authorization process, and you should be able to have access to that clinically, not necessarily through research.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, Dr. Moreno De Luca, when you talk to families, what do families think about testing?
I think the majority of families feel really empowered by having additional information. And they just want to understand what's going on. And it's an extra layer that has all of the benefits that we discussed. It's also important to keep a balanced perspective. As you may be able to tell, I have a bias towards optimism. And so I really want to use this data meaningfully, but I absolutely respect people who don't want to get the testing done, and that doesn't mean that they won't continue having care. Is the same thing as having an MRI. Some families want to do that when there's a clear indication that they need it, and then some families prefer not to do that as well. But the vast majority of families do want that information and feel empowered by that. Now, there's also a couple of things that are on people's mind, again, to present a balanced perspective, and it would be like, is insurance going to discriminate against me now that I have an abnormal genetic result? Is that considered a pre-existing condition or things like that? So thinking about those things, these issues were tackled in the law, and there's actually the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act that protects people from having genetic information used against them for insurance purposes. There's one layer also to present a biased perspective that is not covered, which is life insurance and disability insurance. There's no general protections around that. But that's why these discussions are really important to have in a nuanced way, because the benefits from testing can be much greater than the potential risks of not getting that type of
I
coverage.
think we could have had you here for easily an hour. And you've been so generous with your time, but we may love to have you back.
Thank you very
thank you
much for
so
inviting
much,
me.
Dr. Moreno de Luca, for your knowledge, for your time, for your expertise. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you all for tuning in, and please do let us know. Share your feedback about this show. Please watch the previous episodes. Share with us other topics that you'd like to hear. We'd love to hear from you at autismnewengland@gmail.com. And thank you so much for joining us. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Moreno.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.